When they were young, they loved each other but grew apart. 60 years later, they reunited emotionally in a museum. The metallic sound of his cane echoed through the corridors of the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. George Sullivan, at 83, walked slowly, his weathered blue eyes still sparkling with curiosity as he examined the exhibits. Each artifact, each photograph, each meticulously hung uniform brought back memories of a life that seemed to have taken place long ago, in another world. George stopped in front of a showcase displaying soldiers, personal effects. His wrinkled fingers unconsciously touched his shirt pocket, where he kept his own relic from those days, an old, crumpled and faded photograph. He had carried it with him for over 6 decades, a constant reminder of a face that time had failed to erase from his memory. "Grandpa, look at this!" The excited voice of his 12-year-old granddaughter, Lily, snapped him out of his thoughts. She was enthusiastically pointing to a detailed map of operations in Europe. George smiled, grateful for his granddaughter's company on this journey into the past. "Oh, yes," he replied, approaching with slow steps. "I remember those maps well. We used to spend hours poring over them, planning our movements." Lily looked at her grandfather with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "You really were there, weren't you?" "What was it like, Grandpa?" George hesitated for a moment, pondering how to describe those years to someone so young and innocent. "It was complicated, dear. There was fear, yes, but there was also courage and friendship. Bonds that formed quickly, because you never knew." His voice faltered, and he looked away, focusing on a distant point beyond the museum walls. Lily, noticing the change in her grandfather, gently took his hand. "It's all right, Grandpa. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." George squeezed his granddaughter's hand, grateful for her understanding. "No, it's all right. It's important to remember, you know, so that it never happens again." He paused, taking a deep breath. "You know, Lily, war isn't just about battles and strategies. It's about people. People like me, like your school friends, like your parents. Ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances." They continued walking through the museum, George occasionally sharing stories about his experience, carefully edited for Lily's young ears. He talked about the friends he made, the cities he saw, the moments of fear and unexpected joy. But there was one story he didn't tell, one he kept deep in his heart, a story about a face in a photograph, a name he whispered to himself on lonely nights. Margaret. Her name was like a prayer, a reminder of a love that blossomed in the midst of chaos and was brutally interrupted by the reality of war. As they approached the section dedicated to the war effort at home, George felt a tightening in his chest. The images of women working in factories, nurses caring for the wounded, families saving resources to support the troops, all reminded him of her. "Grandpa, who's that girl?" Lily asked, pointing to a photograph of a young nurse smiling at the camera. George adjusted his glasses, leaning in to get a better look. For a moment, his heart stopped. The resemblance was incredible, but it couldn't be. Could it? He blinked several times, trying to focus better on the image. She reminds me of someone I knew a long time ago," George replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily, sensing the emotion in her grandfather's voice, looked at him with concern. "Someone important?" George nodded slowly. "Very important, dear. Someone who I've lost." At that moment, a soft, trembling voice sounded behind them. George Sullivan, is that you?" Time seemed to freeze. George turned around slowly, his heart beating so hard that he feared it might fail him at any moment. And there she was. Older, of course, with silver hair and graceful lines marking her face, but with the same green eyes that had captured his heart so many decades ago. "Margaret," he whispered, hardly believing his eyes. Tears began to form in both their eyes as they looked at each other. Decades of memories, regrets, and what could have been passing between them in seconds. Lily looked from one to the other, confused but feeling that she was witnessing something deeply meaningful. Margaret stepped forward, her hand trembling slightly as she extended it towards George. I thought I'd never see you again." George took her hand, the touch familiar even after all these years. "I never stopped looking for you," he admitted, his voice laced with emotion. There, in the middle of the National World War II Museum, surrounded by memories of a shared past, two long-separated souls were reunited. The world around them disappeared, and for a moment, they were young again, full of hope and love, ready to face any challenge fate threw at them. Lily watched, fascinated, as her grandfather and this mysterious woman embraced, sobbing silently. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she knew she was witnessing something extraordinary. Something that spoke of love, loss, and perhaps redemption. As the day at the museum drew to a close, George knew that his life had changed irrevocably. The past he had carried around for so long was no longer just a distant memory, but a tangible reality. And with Margaret back in his life, the future suddenly seemed full of possibilities that he thought had been lost forever. The afternoon New Orleans sun cast a golden glow over the streets of the French Quarter as George, Margaret, and Lily left the museum. The air was heavy with the scent of magnolias and the distant sound of jazz, but for George and Margaret, the outside world barely existed. They walked side by side, their steps slow and hesitant, as if they feared that a sudden movement might undo the miracle of their reunion. Lily, ever attentive, noticed the change in her grandfather's demeanor. The man she knew as quiet and reserved now seemed to vibrate with renewed energy, his eyes shining in a way she had never seen before. "There's a lovely cafe around the corner," Margaret suggested, her voice still trembling slightly with excitement. "Perhaps we could have a little chat?" George nodded, unable to contain a smile. "I'd love that." Café Beignet was a cozy place, with wrought iron tables spread out under a green and white striped awning. The aroma of freshly ground coffee and the city's famous beignets filled the air. They settled at a table in the corner, Lily sitting between her grandfather and the woman she had only just met, but who clearly meant a lot to him. A friendly waitress took their orders, coffee for the adults, a hot chocolate for Lily, and a portion of beignets to share. When she left, an uncomfortable silence fell over the table. There were so many things to say, so many questions to ask, that it was hard to know where to start. It was Lily who finally broke the silence. "So, you met during the war?" Margaret smiled gently at the girl. "Yes, dear. I was a nurse in a field hospital in France. Your grandfather was brought to us after I was wounded in battle," George added, his hand unconsciously touching the left side of his chest, where an old scar still marked his skin. "Margaret looked after me. She saved my life." Lily's eyes widened. "Wow, Grandpa. You never told me that." George exchanged a glance with Margaret, years of untold history passing between them. "There are many things about that time that I've never told you, Lily. Some memories are difficult to revisit." Margaret reached across the table, gently touching George's fingers. "But some memories are worth remembering, aren't they?" George turned his hand palm up, entwining his fingers with Margaret's. The gesture, so simple and yet so intimate, made them both hold their breath. "I've never forgotten you, Maggie," George said softly, using the nickname that only he had used so many years ago. "All those years, I wondered." "Me too," Margaret interrupted, tears shining in her eyes. "I looked for you, George. When the war ended, I tried to find information, but it was chaos," George added. "So many lives disrupted, so many people displaced, and I was sent back home before I could say goodbye properly." Lily watched the interaction, fascinated. She had always seen her grandfather as a strong but distant figure. To see him like this, vulnerable and open, was a revelation. The waitress returned with their orders, providing a brief pause in the emotionally charged conversation. They picked up their beignets, the icing sugar falling like snow on the table. "So, what happened after the war?" Lily asked, her curiosity overcoming her hesitation. George and Margaret exchanged glances, each encouraging the other to speak. Margaret was the first to answer. "Well, I continued working as a nurse for a while. Eventually, I came back to the States and settled in Boston. I got married, had children." She paused, a flash of pain crossing her face. "My husband passed away a few years ago." George gently squeezed her hand in sympathy. "I'm sorry, Maggie," she smiled sadly. "And you, George? How was your life after the war?" George took a deep breath. "I went back home to Chicago. I tried to get my life back together, but, well, it wasn't easy. The nightmares, the memories." He looked at Lily, measuring his words. "Eventually, I met Lily's grandmother. We got married, had children. I built a life, but there was always a part of me that stayed at that time, in that hospital in France." Silence fell over them again, each lost in their own reflections. Lily looked from one to the other, feeling the weight of the story they shared. Did you love each other?" Lily asked hesitantly. George and Margaret looked at each other, decades of unspoken emotions passing between them. "Yes," George replied simply. "Yes, we loved each other." Margaret wiped away a tear. "It was a difficult time, Lily. Love could blossom quickly, intensely, because we never knew how long we'd have. But war has a way of tearing people apart." Lily nodded, trying to understand. "And now, what happens now that you've found each other again?" The question hung in the air, full of possibilities and uncertainties. George and Margaret looked at each other, years of regrets and what-ifs passing between them. "Now," George said slowly, "now we have the chance to make up for lost time, to get to know the people we've become over the years." Margaret smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of tears and hope. "Maybe we can be friends again. Share our stories, our lives." "I'd like that very much," George replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. As the sun began to set, painting the New Orleans sky in shades of orange and pink, the three of them remained in the cafe, sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes tears. It was the start of something new, a chance to heal old wounds and create new memories. For Lily, it was as if a new chapter was opening in her grandfather's life, and she couldn't wait to see what the future held for them all. The days following their reunion at the museum passed like a dream for George. New Orleans, with its unique charm and engaging atmosphere, provided the perfect setting for him and Margaret to rediscover each other. Lily, with her youthful curiosity and infectious enthusiasm, acted as a bridge between past and present, her questions often leading to stories long forgotten. One sunny morning, the three of them decided to take a stroll through the Garden District. The tree-lined streets, flanked by stately mansions and lush gardens, offered a serene setting for their conversations. George and Margaret walked side by side, their steps slow and synchronized, while Lily skipped ahead, occasionally stopping to admire a particularly beautiful flower or interesting architecture. "You know, Maggie," George began, his voice soft and thoughtful, "all these years, I've wondered what it would have been like if things had been different, if the war hadn't torn us apart." Margaret smiled, a touch of melancholy in her eyes. "Me too, George. But I think we've learned that we can't live on what-ifs, can we?" George nodded, his gaze turning to Lily, who was a few meters ahead, taking pictures with her cell phone. "You're right. Our lives have taken different turns, but look what we've gained." He gestured towards his granddaughter. "I wouldn't trade Lily, or any of my children and grandchildren, for anything in the world." "Nor would I trade my family," Margaret agreed. "But that doesn't mean we can't appreciate this unexpected gift that fate has given us." They stopped under the shade of a century-old oak tree, its leaves filtering the sunlight into dancing patterns on the ground. George turned to Margaret, taking her hands in his. "Maggie, I know we only have a few days before Lily and I go back to Chicago, but I don't want this to be the end. Not again." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, George, I don't want it to be the end either. But how can we make it work? Our lives are in different places, literally." Before George could reply, Lily came running back, her eyes shining with excitement. "Grandpa, Mrs. Margaret, look what I've found!" She held out her hand, revealing an old, worn coin. Margaret leaned over to examine Lily's find. "Why, that looks like a coin from the Civil War era." "What a fascinating find, dear." George smiled, grateful for the interruption that eased the tension of the moment. "You've always had a keen eye for hidden treasures, haven't you, Lily?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "It's like you always say, Grandpa, history is everywhere. We just need to know where to look." Lily's words triggered an idea in George. He looked at Margaret, a new light in his eyes. "Maybe that's it, Maggie. Maybe we can find a way to share our story, not just with each other, but with other people too." Margaret tilted her head, intrigued. "What do you have in mind, George?" "Well, I've always thought about writing my memoirs of the war, but I've never found the courage or the motivation to do it. But now, with you here." He paused, organizing his thoughts. "What if we wrote together? Our experiences, our different perspectives, a soldier and a nurse. We could collaborate from a distance, use email, video calls." Margaret's eyes lit up at the idea. "George, that's brilliant. It would be a way of keeping in touch, sharing our stories, and maybe even helping other people to understand that time better." Lily, who had been listening to the conversation with interest, intervened. "I can help. I can type it up for you, Grandpa, and I can help with the internet research." George laughed, pulling his granddaughter into a side hug. "It would be wonderful to have your help, dear. How about this, Maggie? An intergenerational family project." Margaret smiled broadly, the idea clearly exciting her. "I'd love that. And who knows, maybe we can get together from time to time to work on the project in person. I'm sure Boston and Chicago have direct flights." The rest of the Garden District tour was filled with lively discussions about the book project. They debated which stories to include, how to structure the narrative, and even joked about who would write the dedication. As the day progressed, they found a small cafe on Magazine Street for a late lunch. As they savored po' boy sandwiches and shared a portion of jambalaya, the conversation naturally turned to their current lives. "So, Margaret," George began, "you mentioned that you still live in Boston. What have you been doing since you retired from nursing?" Margaret took a sip of her iced tea before answering. "Well, after I retired, I started doing volunteer work at the local VA hospital. I felt it was a way to continue helping, especially those who have served like you, George." George nodded in approval. "That's admirable, Maggie. I always knew you had a heart of gold." "What about you, Grandpa?" Lily asked, swallowing a piece of her sandwich. "You never told me much about what you did after the war." George exchanged a glance with Margaret before answering. "Well, darling, when I came home, things were difficult for a while. Many of us struggled to readjust to civilian life." He paused, lost in memories for a moment. "But eventually, I used the GI Bill to go to college. I studied engineering and spent most of my career working on infrastructure projects. I helped build bridges, roads, things that connect people." Margaret smiled softly. "Always a builder, aren't you, George? Even during the war, you always talked about wanting to create things, not destroy them." Margaret's words touched something deep in George. "Do you remember that?" "Of course I do," Margaret replied, her eyes soft with the memory. "I remember many of our conversations in that hospital. They were moments of light in very dark times." Lily looked from one to the other, fascinated by the connection she saw between them. "You two have so much history together. It's amazing that you found each other again after so long." George smiled at his granddaughter. "It's true, Lily. And you know what? It makes me think of all the stories I haven't told you and your cousins yet. Maybe this book project is an opportunity to share them not only with the world, but with our own family." The rest of the afternoon passed quickly, with the three of them discussing ideas for the book and sharing more stories. When they finally got up to head back to the hotel, there was a sense of purpose and anticipation in the air. As they walked through the busy streets of New Orleans, George suddenly stopped, turning to Margaret. "You know, Maggie, whatever happens with this book, I'm so grateful that we had this chance to meet again, to close this circle." Margaret smiled, her eyes shining with emotion. "Me too, George. Who knew that after all these decades, we'd still have a new chapter to write?" Lily, watching the exchange, felt the weight of the moment. She realized that she was witnessing not only her grandfather's story, but a piece of history itself. And now, somehow, she too was part of that narrative. As the sun began to set over New Orleans, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the three of them walked back to the hotel, united not only by the past, but by a future full of possibilities. The weeks that followed George and Lily's return to Chicago were marked by a mixture of excitement and challenge. The book project, which had seemed so promising in New Orleans, now faced the obstacles of distance and daily routines. On a particularly chilly autumn Saturday afternoon, George was sitting in his makeshift office, a cozy corner of the living room overlooking the neighborhood park. His laptop was open, the screen displaying a blank document that stared back at him, as if daring him to start. The soft sound of a notification snapped him out of his thoughts. It was Margaret, initiating a video call. George smiled, adjusting his glasses before accepting the call. "Hello, Maggie," he greeted, his face lighting up when he saw the familiar face on the screen. "George," Margaret replied with a warm smile. "How's the writing going?" George sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. "To be honest, I'm having trouble getting started. There are so many memories, so many stories. It's hard to know where to start." Margaret nodded understandingly. "I understand. I've been facing the same problem. Sometimes, when I try to write, the memories become so vivid that it's almost painful." There was a moment of shared silence, both lost in their own reflections. It was Margaret who finally broke the silence. "You know, George, maybe we're going about this the wrong way. What if, instead of trying to tell the whole story at once, we started with specific moments, little vignettes that capture the essence of what we experienced?" George's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "That's brilliant, Maggie. We could start with the day we met." Do you remember?" Margaret laughed softly. "How could I forget? You were brought into hospital, injured and unconscious. I was in the middle of a double shift, exhausted and overwhelmed. But when you opened your eyes—" She paused, her voice becoming softer. It was as if, for a moment, all the chaos of the war had disappeared. George felt a lump in his throat at the memory. "I remember opening my eyes and seeing you. I thought I'd died and seen an angel." They laughed together, the tension of the moment dissipating. "Well," George said, his fingers already moving over the keyboard, "I think we've found our starting point." Over the next few hours, George and Margaret worked together, sharing memories, laughing at long-forgotten stories, and sometimes stopping to wipe away silent tears. The blank canvas slowly filled with words, capturing fragments of their shared experiences. As they worked, Lily quietly entered the room, curious about her grandfather's project. She sat quietly in a corner, watching the interaction between George and Margaret with fascination. "Grandpa," Lily finally spoke, during a pause in the conversation, "can I ask you a question?" George turned, surprised, but smiling at his granddaughter. "Of course, dear. What do you want to know?" Lily hesitated for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "You and Mrs. Margaret, do you still love each other?" The silence that followed was heavy. George and Margaret exchanged glances across the computer screen, decades of unspoken emotions passing between them. George finally answered, his voice soft but firm. "Lily, love is complicated, especially when you're living through something as intense as war. Margaret and I shared a bond that time and distance couldn't erase. But we've also built separate lives. We love other people." Margaret nodded, adding gently, "What your grandfather and I have now is a love based on shared memories, mutual respect, and a deep friendship. It's different from what we had when we were young, but no less valuable." Lily seemed to ponder this. "But what about Grandma? Did you love her too?" George felt a tightness in his chest. He got up from his chair and walked over to Lily, taking a seat next to her on the sofa. "Lily, I loved your grandmother very much. Our love grew over the years, through the joys and challenges we faced together. The fact that I loved Margaret in the past in no way diminishes the love I had for your grandmother." Margaret, watching the scene through the computer screen, felt her eyes fill with tears. "George is right, Lily. The human heart has an incredible capacity to love in different ways. It's not a question of comparison or competition." Lily nodded slowly, processing what she had heard. "I think I understand. It's how I love you, Grandpa. But I also love my parents and my friends. They're different loves, but they're all real." George smiled, hugging his granddaughter. "Exactly, darling. You're very wise for your age." The rest of the afternoon was spent with the three of them talking, with Lily asking questions about the war, about what life was like back then. George and Margaret answered as best they could, always conscious of balancing the truth with what was appropriate for Lily's young ears. As the sun began to set, painting the Chicago sky in shades of orange and pink, George found himself reflecting on the day. The book project had come to life in a way he hadn't expected, not only capturing his memories, but also creating new connections between the generations. When they finally said goodbye to Margaret, promising to continue the work the next day, George felt strangely energized. He looked at the document on his computer, now full of stories and memories, and felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't experienced for years. "Grandpa," Lily said, as they prepared dinner together, "I'm really happy that you and Mrs. Margaret have found each other again, and I'm excited to help with the book." George smiled, affectionately ruffling his granddaughter's hair. "I'm happy too, Lily. And you know what? I think this book is going to be more than just our war memories. It's going to be a story about how the past and the present intertwine, about how love can take many different forms. As they sat down to dinner, George felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced for a long time. The weight of the past, which he had carried for so many years, seemed lighter now. With Margaret back in his life, albeit from a distance, and with Lily's love and curiosity to guide him, he felt ready to face not only the memories of the past, but also the possibilities of the future. Night fell over Chicago, and with it came the promise of new chapters yet to be written, both in the book and in their lives. Winter came to Chicago with a silent fury, covering the city in a white blanket of snow. George watched the flakes falling outside his apartment window, lost in thought. The book project with Margaret had progressed steadily over the last few months, but as they delved deeper into their memories, old wounds began to reopen. The sound of a notification brought him out of his reverie. It was a message from Margaret. "George, can we talk? It's important." With his heart racing a little, George started the video call. Margaret's face appeared on the screen, her eyes red and swollen. Clearly, she had been crying. "Maggie, what's wrong?" George asked, the concern evident in his voice. Margaret took a deep breath before answering. "George, I've been reviewing our notes on the Battle of St. Lo, and I remembered something I never told you." George felt a knot forming in his stomach. The Battle of St. Lo had been one of the most brutal moments of his wartime experience, and he knew that Margaret had lost many patients during that period. "What is it, Maggie?" he asked softly. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering her courage. "Do you remember your friend, the young soldier from Minnesota, Charlie?" George nodded slowly. Charlie had been one of the best friends he'd made during the war, a farm boy with an easy smile and an infectious laugh. "Charlie. He arrived at our hospital during the battle," Margaret continued, her voice shaking slightly. "He was badly wounded, George. He asked me not to tell you he was there. He didn't want you to see him in that state." George felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. "Charlie. Did he survive?" Margaret shook her head slowly, tears running down her cheeks. "We did everything we could, George, but the injuries were very serious. He asked me to give you a message if we ever met again." George leaned forward, his body tense. "What message, Maggie?" He said, "Tell George it was an honor to fight alongside him, and tell him to live the life we dreamed of having after the war, for all of us who couldn't." The silence that followed was deafening. George felt the tears streaming down his face, the pain of losing his friend as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. "Why didn't you tell me before, Maggie?" he finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse with emotion. Margaret wiped away her own tears. "I wanted to, George. So many times I wanted to. But after you were sent back home, and then when we lost touch, I carried that secret for so long." "I'm so sorry." George closed his eyes, letting the memories of Charlie flood his mind. The nights they lay awake talking about their plans for the future, the jokes they shared amid the chaos of war, the last look they exchanged before George was wounded and sent to hospital. "Thank you for telling me now, Maggie," George finally said, opening his eyes to look at her. "Charlie deserves to be remembered. I think we should include his story in the book." Margaret nodded, a small smile appearing through her tears. "I think he'd like that." At that moment, the door to the apartment opened and Lily walked in, shaking the snow off her coat. She stopped at the sight of her grandfather in tears. "Grandpa, is everything all right?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. George gestured for her to come closer. "Come here, dear. there's a story I want to tell you. About a great friend I made during the war." As Lily settled down next to her grandfather, Margaret watched the computer screen. There was a feeling that something important was happening, a link being forged between the past and the present. George began to tell Charlie's story, his voice gaining strength as he shared memories of his lost friend. Lily listened intently, occasionally asking questions, her eyes shining with a mixture of fascination and sadness. As the afternoon progressed, the conversation expanded. George and Margaret shared more stories of their time in the war, not just those of loss and pain, but also moments of courage, friendship, and even unexpected joy in the midst of chaos. "You know, Lily," George said in a moment of reflection, "one of the hardest things about war is how it can change you. You see and experience things that no one should, but you also learn about the strength of the human spirit, about how people can pull together and support each other in the darkest moments." Margaret nodded in agreement. "It's true. And I think that's why this book project is so important. It's not just about remembering the past, but about learning from it." Lily, who had been quiet for a while, finally spoke. "Grandpa, Mrs. Margaret, thank you for sharing these stories with me. I never really understood before. At school, we learn about dates and battles. But this is different." George smiled softly at his granddaughter, slipping his arm around her shoulders. "It is different, dear. And it's important that you young people understand, not to glorify war, but to value peace." Night fell over Chicago, the snow continuing to fall softly outside. Inside George's apartment, there was a sense that something had changed. The stories shared, the tears shed, the memories relived. All of this had created a deeper connection between them. When they finally said goodbye to Margaret, promising to continue work on the book over the next few days, George felt exhausted, but strangely at peace. The weight of Margaret's secret about Charlie was hard to carry, but there was also a sense of relief at finally knowing the truth. As he prepared for bed, George thought about Charlie, about Margaret, about all those who had been part of his journey during the war. He thought of the promise he had made to himself so many years ago, to live the life that so many of his comrades had not had the chance to live. With a sigh, he picked up his notebook and began to write. The words flowed easily now, charged with emotion and memory. This wasn't just the story of George and Margaret, he realized. It was the story of a whole generation, of lives interrupted and dreams deferred, of courage in the face of adversity, and of hope that persisted even in the darkest moments. And as the words filled the page, George felt that he was finally fulfilling the promise he had made to Charlie and all the others who had been left behind. He was telling their stories, making sure they weren't forgotten. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the city in a reverent silence, as if the world itself was paying homage to the memories being unearthed and the stories being told. Spring arrived in Chicago, bringing with it not only the blooming of flowers in the city's parks, but also a new sense of purpose for George. The book project had turned into something bigger than he and Margaret had ever imagined. What had begun as an exercise in memory had become a mission to share a crucial part of history with younger generations. On a sunny April afternoon, George was sitting in his makeshift office, rereading some of the passages he and Margaret had written. The sound of a notification on his computer alerted him to a video call from Lily. "Hi, Grandpa," Lily greeted cheerfully as soon as the call was connected. Her face was beaming with excitement. "I've got a surprise for you." George smiled, always delighted by his granddaughter's enthusiasm. "Hello, dear. What's the surprise?" Lily turned away from the camera, revealing that she was in her classroom, My history teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, is here with me. She wants to talk to you about your book." A middle-aged woman with a warm smile appeared next to Lily. "Mr. Sullivan, it's a pleasure to meet you. Lily told us about the book you're writing with your friend Margaret. We're all fascinated." George felt a surge of pride and also a little nervousness. "It's my pleasure, Mrs. Rodriguez. I confess I'm surprised that our little project has attracted so much attention." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. "Mr. Sullivan, I believe that what you and Ms. Margaret are doing is incredibly valuable. Our children learn about World War II in textbooks, but to hear first-hand stories, especially from perspectives as unique as those of a soldier and a nurse, well, that's invaluable." Lily intervened. "Grandpa, Mrs. Rodriguez wants to know if you'd be willing to give a talk to our class. Tell some of the stories from the book." George was momentarily speechless. The idea of talking about his experiences to a group of young people was both exciting and intimidating. I'd be honored," he finally managed to say. "But I think Margaret should be involved too. After all, this is as much her story as mine." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled broadly. "That would be wonderful. We could organize a video conference so that Mrs. Margaret could participate from Boston. What do you think about doing it next month, to coincide with our unit on the Second World War?" George nodded, feeling a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. "That sounds perfect. I'll get in touch with Margaret and we'll start preparing." After settling the details and saying goodbye, George immediately called Margaret to share the news. She was as surprised and excited as he was. "Oh, George," Margaret said, her voice full of emotion. "Who knew our little project would go so far? I'm a bit nervous, to be honest." George laughed softly. "Me too, Maggie. But I think it's important. These young people, they need to understand what happened, not just as facts in a book, but as real experiences from real people." The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. George and Margaret spent hours revising their notes, selecting stories that would be appropriate to share with the students, and discussing the best way to present them. Lily became an integral part of the process, helping her grandfather familiarize himself with the technology needed for the video conference and offering insights into what her classmates would find most interesting. Finally, the big day arrived. George nervously adjusted his tie as he sat in front of the computer in his office. The screen was divided into two parts. On one side, he could see Margaret in her Boston apartment, and on the other, Lily's classroom, full of young, curious faces. Mrs. Rodriguez began the session with a brief introduction, and then passed the floor to George and Margaret. For a moment, George felt a lump in his throat, the memories of difficult times threatening to overwhelm him. But then he saw Lily's eager face among his classmates, and found the strength to begin. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. "My name is George Sullivan, and joining me is Margaret Thompson. We both experienced the Second World War in very different ways, me as a soldier and Margaret as a nurse. What we're going to share with you today are not just facts and dates, but real experiences, moments that shaped our lives and the lives of millions of others." Margaret continued, "We want you to understand that war is not just about battles and strategies. It's about people like you and your families, facing extraordinary circumstances." As George and Margaret began to share their stories, the classroom fell silent. The students listened intently, their eyes wide with fascination and, at times, horror, as the realities of war unfolded before them. They talked about the fear and uncertainty of the first days after enlistment, about the camaraderie that formed between soldiers and nurses, about the moments of terror during battles and the periods of boredom in between. They shared stories of loss and pain, but also of courage, hope, and even moments of unexpected joy in the midst of chaos. George told the students about Charlie, his voice breaking with emotion as he recounted his friend's courage and the final message he had left. Margaret spoke about the countless lives that had passed through her hands, some that she had managed to save and others that she had had to see go. As the session progressed, the students began to ask questions. Their inquiries ranged from practical details about life during the war to deeper questions about dealing with fear and grief. One young woman raised her hand shyly. "Mr. Sullivan, Mrs. Thompson, how did you manage to move on after the war? How did you cope with everything you lived through?" George and Margaret exchanged a glance across the screen. It was Margaret who answered first. "It wasn't easy, dear. Many of us struggled to readjust to normal life. But I think what helped us was to remember that we had survived for a reason. We had a responsibility to live our lives as best we could, in honor of those who didn't get the chance." George nodded in agreement. "And you know what? Being here today, sharing these stories with you, is an important part of that process. It's a way of ensuring that the lessons we've learned, the lives that have been lost, are not forgotten." As the session drew to a close, there were tears in the eyes of many, not just the students, but also George, Margaret, and even Mrs. Rodriguez. But there was also a palpable feeling of connection, of bridges being built between generations. After the students left and the video conference ended, George sat for a long moment, reflecting on what had just happened. He felt exhausted, but also incredibly fulfilled. The sound of a new notification brought him back to the present. It was a message from Lily. "Grandpa, you and Mrs. Margaret were amazing today. Thank you for sharing your stories with us. I think we all understand a little better now what never forget really means. I love you so much." George smiled, feeling a surge of emotion. He looked at the photograph of Charlie on his desk, at the manuscript of the book he and Margaret were writing, and at the message from his granddaughter. At that moment, he felt that he had fulfilled a promise made long ago, the promise to live, to remember, and to share. The afternoon sun shone through the window, illuminating the office with a golden glow. George closed his eyes for a moment, letting a sense of peace and fulfillment envelop him. Past and present had met today, and the future, represented by those attentive young faces, looked a little brighter. Autumn had returned to Chicago, bringing with it a symphony of colors that painted the city's parks. George Sullivan, now 84, walked slowly through O'Hare International Airport, his hand firmly on the arm of his granddaughter, Lily. Her eyes, although a little more tired, still shone with a mixture of anxiety and expectation. "Grandpa, are you okay?" Lily asked, noticing George's slightly labored breathing. George smiled, patting Lily's hand affectionately. "I'm fine, dear. Just a bit nervous, that's all." They were at the airport to welcome Margaret, who was flying in from Boston for the official launch of the book she and George had spent the last year writing. Echoes of Courage, Memoirs of a Soldier and a Nurse, had become much more than a simple memoir project. It was a powerful testimony to a generation that had faced unimaginable adversity, a reminder of the lessons of the past for future generations. When Margaret finally appeared in the landing area, George felt his heart race. Even after all these years, even after months of almost daily video call conversations, seeing her in person still moved him deeply. "Maggie," he called out, his voice laced with emotion. Margaret smiled broadly at the sight of them, her eyes filling with tears. "George, Lily." The three of them embraced, a moment of connection that seemed to transcend time and space. When they finally separated, they all had tears in their eyes and smiles on their faces. "Well," Margaret said, wiping her eyes, "I think we're ready for this, aren't we?" George nodded, feeling a surge of determination. "More than ready, Maggie. It's time to share our story with the world." The book launch event was held in a bookstore in downtown Chicago. To George and Margaret's surprise and delight, the place was packed. There were war veterans, some as old as themselves, others from more recent conflicts. There were young students, including Lily's entire class. There were journalists, historians, and ordinary readers, all eager to hear the stories George and Margaret had to share. When it was time to speak, George and Margaret stood side by side on the small stage. For a moment, they were both silent, looking out at the gathered crowd. George felt Margaret's hand reach for his, and he squeezed it gently, finding strength in the contact. "Good evening, everyone," George began, his voice firm despite his nervousness. "Margaret and I are deeply honored by your presence here this evening. The book we are launching is not just our story. It's the story of an entire generation, of millions of men and women who faced the unimaginable and emerged to tell the tale." Margaret continued, "When we started this project, we thought we were just remembering the past. But along the way, we discovered that we were doing much more than that. We were building bridges between the past and the present, between generations, between people who might otherwise never have connected." They continued alternating the narrative, sharing excerpts from the book, answering questions from the audience and reflecting on the writing process. They spoke about the joys and challenges of reliving long-buried memories, about the healing that came with sharing their stories, and about the hope they had for the future. A young Afghanistan war veteran raised his hand. "Mr. Sullivan, Ms. Thompson, how did you deal with what we now call PTSD? How did you manage to move on after everything you experienced?" George and Margaret exchanged a thoughtful glance before George answered. "It wasn't something we talked about much back then. Many of us simply tried to bury those memories, to move on. But I've learned over the years that silence can be just as destructive as the memories themselves. Talking, sharing our experiences, whether with loved ones, therapists, or even through this book, was a crucial part of the healing process." Margaret nodded in agreement. "And it's important to remember that healing is not a destination. It's a journey. Even now, so many decades later, there are still difficult days. But there's also a lot of joy, a lot of love, and a lot of hope." As the evening progressed, George noticed Lily sitting in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. He thought about how this project had not only reconnected him and Margaret, but had also brought him closer to his family in a way he had never imagined possible. When the event finally came to an end, and the last copies of the book were signed, George, Margaret, and Lily found themselves alone in the now empty bookshop. The silence was comfortable, full of unspoken emotions and a sense of accomplishment. "Well," George finally said, "I think we've done it, Maggie." Margaret smiled, her eyes filling with tears once again. "Yes, George, I think we did it." Lily hugged them both. "I'm so proud of you both. What you've done, it's incredible." George looked at his granddaughter, then at Margaret, and finally at the pile of books on the table in front of him. Each copy represented not only his memories, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder of the lessons of the past and a guiding light for the future. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "when I was young, I dreamed of doing something important, something that would leave a mark on the world. I never imagined it would be like this, sharing stories of a time many would rather forget." Margaret put her hand on his shoulder. "But it's exactly those stories that need to be told, George, so that future generations can learn, so that they can understand the cost of war and the value of peace." Lily picked up a copy of the book, running her fingers over the cover. "And you're not just telling stories from the past. You're inspiring people in the present. You have no idea how many of my friends have said they want to talk to their grandparents, listen to their stories, after reading this book." George felt a wave of emotion run through him. He thought of Charlie, of all the friends he had lost in the war. He thought of his late wife, his children and grandchildren. He thought of Margaret, this incredible woman whom fate had brought back into his life in such an unexpected way. "I think you're right, Lily," he said softly. "Perhaps this is our true legacy. Not just the stories we tell, but the connections we help create." As they walked out of the bookstore into the Chicago night, George felt a deep sense of peace. The weight of the past, which he had carried for so long, seemed lighter now. Not because the memories were less painful, but because they now had a purpose, a meaning beyond his own experience. The future, which had once seemed so uncertain and frightening to a young soldier in a distant land, now stretched out before him full of possibilities. George knew that, no matter what came next, the stories he and Margaret had shared would continue to echo, touching lives and building bridges long after they were gone. And at that moment, walking arm in arm with Margaret and Lily through the bright streets of Chicago, George Sullivan knew that he had finally found his way home. Did this narrative stir your emotions? Don't forget to express your approval with a like. Take advantage of the Super Thanks feature, available just below the video, to offer direct support to the channel and contribute to the production of more fascinating content. Subscribe and remember to activate the bell to stay up to date with all the latest updates. And attention, a new exciting story is already ready to be displayed on your screen. Your participation means a lot to me, and I hope to count on your presence soon. Thank you very much for dedicating your time to this video.